Firmin Ago. Charles furious after Meghan tries to force her way back, using Kate's forbidden title. There was no balcony appearance, no polished smile, no carefully timed wave to the crowds outside a palace gate. Instead, behind a sealed palace door and under the cold weight of official silence, King Charles was handed a briefing note that changed the mood of the entire royal household in a matter of seconds. It was not a war paper. It was not a constitutional crisis in the formal sense. Yet inside those few pages was something the monarchy has always feared more than noise, more than scandal, more than even public criticism. It was confusion over rank, over symbols, over who had the right to stand where in the royal story. And when Charles understood that Meghan had tried to force her way back into the center of royal life by invoking the one title the palace treated as untouchable, his anger was not theatrical. It was cold, personal, and immediate. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update, because this was the kind of palace conflict that begins with one phrase and ends by exposing tensions the public was never supposed to see. The phrase at the center of it all was simple. Too simple, in fact. That was why it carried such danger. It was a title long wrapped in memory, public sentiment, and private caution. A title burdened not only by present meaning, but by old grief, national emotion, and the careful calculations of the future. Inside palace circles, some names are not just names. They are positions, signals, inheritances. They tell the country who belongs at the heart of the monarchy and who does not. They tell courtiers how to arrange a room, how to draft a line, how to prepare for tomorrow without insulting today. And according to that briefing, Meghan had either encouraged, tolerated, or strategically allowed language to circulate that suggested she could step back into royal gravity by attaching herself to the very symbolic territory the palace had reserved, with extreme caution, around Catherine. That mattered because titles in royal life are never decorative. They are operational. They shape precedents, public expectation, institutional authority, and emotional legitimacy. A title decides who enters first, who speaks next, who stands beside whom, and sometimes, more painfully, who may never stand there at all. Britain, at first, saw only fragments. A phrase here, a report there, murmurs of renewed positioning, suggestions that certain doors might not be fully closed. But inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Charles did not see a harmless attempt at relevance. He saw pressure. He saw symbolism being used as leverage. He saw the quiet architecture of the future crown being touched by someone who had already stepped outside its walls. And above all, he saw Catherine placed in the path of another emotional siege, at a moment when the palace had sworn, in its own guarded way, that such pressure would never be allowed again. The immediate reaction inside the palace was not noise. It was stillness. That was always the first sign something serious had happened. Staff who would normally move with brisk, invisible confidence began speaking in shorter sentences. Private secretaries stopped speculating and started documenting. The King's Red Box, the daily collection of state papers and official communications, remained open longer than usual on his desk. No one raised their voice, but the silence deepened. Charles was in one of the smaller audience rooms when the matter was first put before him in full. He had expected another update on public optics, another advisor's note about commentary abroad, another manageable disturbance from far beyond palace gates. He had not expected to hear that language tied to Catherine's symbolic position had become part of a wider maneuver, interpreted by several senior aides as an attempted soft return through emotional confusion. He had expected concern. He had not expected anger in himself. Yet the moment the implications became clear, witnesses later said his expression hardened, in a way they had seen only when personal pain and institutional risk became impossible to separate. This was not simply about Meghan. It was about the line that protects the future queen. It was about a family that had already been torn apart once by grievance, then again by disclosure, and was now being asked, in effect, whether its most sensitive symbols were still secure. In another part of the royal estate, the reaction was quieter and perhaps even more devastating. Catherine did not need a constitutional lecture to understand the danger. She understood something older and sadder. She understood what happens when a title becomes a battlefield. She understood what happens when the public is invited, even indirectly, to imagine two women standing in one emotional space that the monarchy insists can belong to only one. She understood memory, comparison, projection, and the cruelty of public narrative. And when she was informed, not in lurid terms, but with the careful restraint the palace uses for its worst news, her response was said to be measured, almost too measured. She asked no dramatic questions. She requested no immediate reaction. She simply grew very still. William's response was different. Where Catherine internalized, William sharpened. Those close to him had seen it before. The controlled face, the clipped phrasing, the effort to remain princely while old wounds pressed hard against present duty. He did not view the matter as a media misunderstanding. He viewed it as intrusion, not into a headline, but into the protected core of his wife's role, his children's future, and the already difficult path being laid toward the next reign. The monarchy could survive many things, but not confusion about succession dressed up as sentiment. That, in William's mind, was the beginning of disorder. Yet to understand why Charles reacted with such fury, it is necessary to go back, because the decision forming in those palace rooms was not born that morning. The story did not begin with one circulated phrase or one attempted narrative shift. It began much earlier, in the years when the palace learned the hard way that symbols left undefended do not remain neutral for long. Long before this latest rupture, there had been a private discussion at the highest level of the household about what might be called protected titles. Not protected by law in the simple public sense, but protected by history, transition planning, emotional risk, and strategic restraint. One of those titles was connected to Catherine's future and to the careful shaping of her public role. In royal terms, a forbidden title does not always mean illegal. It means untouchable without approval. It means that even floating it, even allowing it to gather atmosphere around the wrong person, is seen as a challenge to order. What triggered that internal doctrine was an incident few outside palace walls ever properly understood. It happened during preparations for a major ceremonial period, when advisors noticed how quickly public and international commentary could distort the meaning of female royal status. Certain names began circulating in ways the palace regarded as destabilizing. Comparisons multiplied. Old wounds reopened. The institution realized then that titles associated with future authority had to be fenced off before they were consumed by competition, grievance, or fantasy. The official household, meaning the system of aides, secretaries, ceremonial officers, and senior royal staff, who keep the monarchy functioning day to day, started quietly refining what could be said, when it could be said, and by whom. That hidden lesson became even more important after Catherine's role deepened. Hers was not simply a marriage into royalty. It became, over time, a visible embodiment of continuity. She did not seize that place. She grew into it, often under pressure, often under scrutiny, and almost always beneath the weight of national comparison. The country saw grace. The palace saw endurance. It saw someone learning how to carry symbolic burdens without speaking about them. That mattered, because monarchy is not only about power, it is about who can absorb pressure without letting the crown appear shaken. Then came the older triggering incident, the one several advisors later returned to when they argued that Charles had no room left for ambiguity. It was a closed ceremonial rehearsal, the kind almost no one talks about because it reveals how much of monarchy is choreography long before it becomes history. Seating, entry sequence, forms of address, briefing language, future contingencies. All of it was under review. During that process, one aide flagged the dangerous speed with which public narratives could assign meaning to titles not yet in play. Another warned that if personal branding ever collided with succession symbolism, the result would not be mere gossip. It would be constitutional shadow play. Succession meant more than who wore the crown next. It meant the disciplined preparation of public imagination. The crown cannot pass smoothly if the nation is encouraged to fantasize about alternate centers of emotional legitimacy. Charles did not forget that warning. Neither did William. So when this new situation emerged, it hit an already bruised fault line. Palace officials were not only assessing a headline, they were assessing whether an old danger had returned in sharper form. Was this accidental language? A trial balloon? A pressure tactic? A branding maneuver with royal consequences? No one in the inner rooms wanted to overreact, yet no one wanted to repeat the old mistake of allowing symbolism to drift until the public began treating it as reality. What followed was one of those meetings the monarchy never admits in detail but cannot function without. Present were senior communications officials, constitutional advisors, and figures from the king's private office. A constitutional advisor is not a politician in that room. It is someone tasked with understanding how public meaning can affect institutional stability. They do not merely ask whether something is true. They ask whether something, if believed, alters the conditions under which the monarchy operates. The Lord Chamberlain's office was consulted in relation to ceremonial consequence. The private secretary's office focused on immediate containment. William's team was looped in not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. The question was severe in its simplicity. If Meghan was perceived to be using Catherine's forbidden symbolic territory to negotiate relevance, sympathy, or return, should the palace answer directly, or should it suffocate the idea by refusing it oxygen? Charles listened, but not passively. He wanted to know who had seen what, who had been warned, who believed this was intentional, and who thought delay might worsen the matter. His frustration, those briefed later said, did not come from panic. It came from exhaustion. He was tired of wounds reopening through implication, tired of the monarchy being pulled into emotional traps disguised as misunderstood phrasing, tired of Catherine's place in the future being treated as though it were available for symbolic trespass. Tired, perhaps most personally of all, of seeing family conflict return through the language of female titles, where pain is often amplified and dignity most tested. But before any response could be shaped, another, more private confrontation had to happen. Charles and William needed to speak alone. The meeting took place without spectacle, and that was precisely why it mattered. No cameras, no officials beyond the door, just father and son, bound by blood, divided by history, and joined again by the strange burden of protecting the same institution from different positions within it. Charles began with caution. William did not. The heir had been holding too much for too long. He did not speak only as a son. He spoke as the man expected one day to inherit not only the crown, but the damage left by every unresolved family fracture. William's view was brutally clear. Enough ambiguity. Enough patience being mistaken for weakness. Enough allowing others to brush against Catherine's future role as though it were part of an open negotiation. He was not interested in emotional reinterpretation. He believed lines had to be drawn. He believed the monarchy could be compassionate without being porous. He believed that once a title linked to Catherine's symbolic future was touched in this way, silence would no longer read as dignity. It would read as uncertainty. Charles, for his part, understood the argument, but he also understood something William hated hearing. Every response creates its own headline. Every denial dignifies a rumor. Every correction risks widening the stage. The king still carried a sovereign's instinct for balance. The monarch does not rush toward every fire. Sometimes the crown survives by refusing to kneel to provocation. Yet even as he said this, there was reportedly a moment when his tone changed, because beneath strategy was something rawer. He was angry not only as king, but as a father watching the family's most sensitive fault lines exploited yet again. He had tolerated complaint. He had endured accusation. What he would not tolerate was confusion being built around the future princess at the heart of the next reign. No one raised their voice, but the emotion in that room was unmistakable. William pressed harder. He reminded his father that the public may forgive drama, but it does not forgive visible weakness in succession planning. He argued that Catherine had earned protection not through privilege, but through years of discipline, restraint, and sacrifice. He said, in effect, that there could be no moral equivalence between someone carrying the future of the crown and someone who had walked away from its demands, yet still wished to harvest its symbols. The truth was more painful because Charles did not disagree. That same evening, Catherine and William spoke privately. This conversation, unlike the one between father and son, was softer and in some ways more heartbreaking. Catherine did not want war over a title. She did not want another female rivalry projected onto the family. She did not want public commentary turned once again into a contest of identity. Yet she also knew that silence has a cost when the wrong people begin to define your role before history has even formally placed it upon you. William, still burning from the earlier meeting, wanted firmness. Catherine wanted containment. Between them lay the hardest royal problem of all, how to defend dignity without appearing to fight for it. That night, the palace machinery moved into a more serious phase. Draft language began circulating. Not statements at first, but scenarios. If asked, say this. If pressed, say nothing beyond that. If the symbolism spreads, activate a formal clarification through background briefings. If it crosses into apparent institutional confusion, prepare a palace-level line. The official household was effectively building a defensive wall out of phrases. In royal life, words are barricades. A short sentence can protect a century. A careless one can end a week in disaster. There was also a deeper level of planning. Continuity advisors were asked to review the wider implications. Continuity planning means preparation for the seamless survival of the monarchy through illness, transition, scandal, mourning, or public uncertainty. It is one of the Crown's oldest reflexes. And what worried some officials was not merely the present dispute, it was the precedent. If titles associated with the future sovereign household could be invoked from outside the working royal structure as instruments of leverage, then every later stage of transition might be vulnerable to emotional freelancing. In plain terms, the palace feared a future where symbolism outran authority. As these discussions intensified, another figure entered the emotional frame of the story, even if from a distance. Camilla. Her role in the crisis was not central in public terms, but privately it mattered. She knew better than most what it means for female titles inside the monarchy to become contested terrain. She had lived through years of hostility, suspicion, rejection, adaptation, and relentless scrutiny. She knew that a royal woman's title is never only hers. It becomes a vessel for public anger, memory, and judgment. And because of that, she understood why Charles was so furious. He was not simply guarding protocol. He was trying to stop the family from being dragged once again into the emotional warfare that titles can unleash. Camilla reportedly urged steadiness, not softness. There is a difference. Softness invites pressure. Steadiness denies it drama. Yet even she understood that some lines must be seen, not merely felt. The king, she believed, had to make clear in some form that Catherine's symbolic place was not available for appropriation, imitation, or negotiation. Then came the leak. No palace plans survive intact once enough people know their outlines. A detail slipped, then another. It may have begun with a background conversation. It may have come from someone adjacent to an advisor rather than the advisor themselves. It may simply have emerged because the emotional temperature around the issue had become too high to contain. However it happened, by the next cycle of media reaction, the country was no longer looking at a vague family tremor. It was looking at the possibility of a serious royal boundary dispute, centered on Meghan, Catherine, and the future of female authority within the House of Windsor. Broadcasters did not need to interrupt with a trumpet blast for the shock to spread. The headlines did it on their own. Questions multiplied instantly. Was Meghan trying to test the palace? Had Charles finally lost patience? Was William pushing harder behind the scenes than the king wanted? Why was Catherine's role being treated as sacred ground? And perhaps most dangerously of all, what exactly had happened that made the king furious now, when previous provocations had been met with cooler restraint? Crowds gathered not in the old dramatic sense of chanting outside iron gates, but in the modern national way, through screens, commentaries, call-ins, morning debates, and late-night speculation. The country saw one thing, a family argument over a title. But inside the institution, it was being understood as something more serious. A test of whether the monarchy could still control the symbolic map of its own future. There were, inevitably, voices urging compassion, voices urging reconciliation, voices insisting the entire matter was overblown. Charles heard them, but reconciliation without boundaries, in palace logic, is not mercy, it is surrender of structure, and structure is what keeps monarchy from collapsing into celebrity theater. That was why the next step mattered so much. Rather than issue a theatrical rebuke, the palace moved toward something more devastating in royal terms. Quiet exclusion reinforced by unmistakable internal clarity. Doors would not be slammed in public. That would create martyrdom. Instead, lines of recognition would be tightened. Language would be disciplined. Invitations, imagery, reference points, and future briefings would all make one fact increasingly undeniable. Catherine's path remained protected. Meghan would not be permitted to step into it by symbolism, suggestion, or emotional pressure. The pain of that settlement was sharper because it was not loud. Loud punishments can be denounced, quiet ones simply alter reality. There was one more confrontation before the final shape of the response settled, and it was perhaps the most emotionally revealing of all. Charles, after reviewing successive drafts and hearing successive arguments, is said to have spoken with unusual bluntness about the difference between family feeling and institutional right. Love, he acknowledged, can survive estrangement. Concern can survive anger. But the crown cannot operate on blurred sentiment. It needs hierarchy, it needs sequence, it needs protected meaning. He was not, he insisted, punishing anyone for wishing to be seen. He was refusing to let the future of the monarchy be negotiated through symbolic trespass. That line changed the mood in the room, because it meant the king had moved from frustration to decision. A decision in royal life is rarely announced the way ordinary people imagine. There is seldom one grand sentence. Instead, a web of signals goes out, a briefing hardens, a phrase disappears from circulation, a title is described more narrowly. A future role is spoken of more firmly. Palace contacts begin using the same language. By the time the public notices, the institution has already acted. That is what happened here. Within days, those listening closely heard the shift. Catherine was framed with greater precision. Her place in the future narrative was described more carefully, more protectively, more exclusively. Meanwhile, any suggestion that Meghan could reattach herself to the center of royal identity through title-adjacent symbolism met an invisible wall. Not a tantrum, not a revenge campaign, a wall. William noticed it immediately. So did Catherine. For him, it was confirmation that the line had been drawn at last. For her, it was more complicated. Protection always carries sorrow when it must be built against family. She had never wanted to be the reason for another hardening. Yet she also knew something few could say aloud. If the monarchy did not protect the future queen from symbolic encroachment now, it might fail her when the burden became even heavier later. And that burden was already visible. Catherine's role had grown beyond fashion, beyond charity, beyond smile and composure. She now represented a bridge between a wounded present and an uncertain future. The public wanted warmth from her. The institution needed steel. That combination is rare. It is also why her title, formal or not yet formal, carried such intensity. It was not simply about rank. It was about who the country believed could hold the emotional center of the monarchy when Charles's reign eventually gave way to William's. As for Meghan, the attempt to force re-entry through symbolic proximity to Catherine's protected status, whether calculated or half-calculated, now appeared to have backfired. Instead of opening space, it had triggered the very consolidation she may not have expected. Charles, who had long been accused by some of hesitating too much, had finally treated the matter not as family drama, but as a threat to institutional order. William, who feared softness would invite repetition, had seen his instinct vindicated. And Catherine, without demanding anything, had become the silent axis around which the entire response turned. Yet there was still the question of the nation. Would the public see cruelty in the palace's firmness, or would it see necessity? The answer, as always with the monarchy, was divided. Some viewed the boundary as overdue. Others saw only another chapter in an unhealed family tragedy. But perhaps the most revealing reaction came from those who understood that a royal title is not just a label. It is a line in the constitutional imagination. A constitutional tension is not always about parliament or courts. Sometimes it is about whether the public understands who carries the future burden of the state and who no longer does. In the days that followed, Charles made a public appearance with William and Catherine, not originally designed to carry symbolic weight, yet transformed by timing into something far larger. They stood together, not intimately, not theatrically, but with a composed gravity that told its own story. Charles looked older, yes, and perhaps more tired. William looked guarded. Catherine looked calm, in the way only those under immense pressure learn to appear calm. To the country, it was just another royal moment. To those who had followed the crisis closely, it was the answer. No title needed to be spoken. The picture said enough. There was one private detail from that day that lingered in palace memory. Before stepping into public view, Charles is said to have looked at Catherine not with ceremony, but with something quieter, almost paternal. Not sentimentality, recognition of cost, recognition that the role around her had become a target precisely because it mattered so much. And in that brief exchange, the conflict of the entire episode came into focus. The future was being protected, but protection itself had become a form of pain. This was not a triumphant ending. It was a royal one, which is to say it resolved nothing emotionally while settling everything institutionally. The family remained wounded. The trust did not return. The distance did not disappear. No magical reconciliation emerged from the smoke of title, rank, and injury. But something important had nonetheless happened. Charles had chosen preparation over denial. He had chosen clarity over drift. He had accepted, perhaps more openly than before, that family feeling could no longer be allowed to blur the protected lines around the next reign. And William had seen, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that his father was still capable of drawing a hard boundary when the future of the crown required it. As for Catherine, the woman at the center of the storm without ever publicly entering it, she emerged not louder but more firmly placed. That was the paradox. The attack, if attack it was, had not weakened her symbolic role. It had exposed how indispensable it had become. The more others reached toward it, the more the palace understood it must be defended, not because of vanity, not because of rivalry, because the monarchy cannot pass safely into its next chapter if the woman expected to stand beside that chapter is left undefended in the one before it. And so the story ends where so many royal stories truly begin, not in applause but in acceptance. Acceptance that duty and love no longer move together in the same easy form. Acceptance that some family wounds do not heal, they are managed. Acceptance that a title can be more dangerous than an insult because it touches the invisible architecture of succession itself. Acceptance that the future had been acknowledged without formally ending the present. The country had expected another round of gossip, another emotional tremor from a fractured dynasty. What it witnessed instead was something colder and more consequential. A line had been drawn around the future queen's symbolic ground, and the king himself had drawn it in anger. That anger mattered because it revealed what Charles fears most now. Not criticism, not noise, not even scandal. He fears confusion over the next chapter. He fears the erosion of protected meaning. He fears a monarchy that appears uncertain about who carries its tomorrow. In that sense, his fury was not only personal, it was sovereign. And maybe that is the deepest truth of all. The monarchy can survive embarrassment. It can survive resentment. It can survive exile, books, interviews, accusations, and even silence. But it cannot survive indefinitely if its own sacred symbols become negotiable in the hands of those outside its working core. That was the lesson Charles finally acted upon. That was the warning William had been pressing. That was the burden Catherine has quietly borne. And that was why one disputed title, one forbidden symbolic claim, was enough to shake the palace to its foundations. In the end, no one needed to say Meghan's name from a lectern. No one needed to issue a dramatic decree. The answer came in the oldest language the monarchy knows: placement, silence, recognition, exclusion, and the disciplined arrangement of who stands where when history is watching. Charles stood with the future. William stood with the woman who will bear it beside him. Catherine accepted the burden without reaching for the argument. And somewhere in that careful arrangement, Britain was shown a truth both elegant and brutal. The family may still bleed in private, but the institution has chosen which heart it will protect. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.